So without further ado, let me get started with our afternoon program. This introduction for me is very special because not only do I have the honor of introducing one of the world's leading thought leaders, I have the great privilege of being able to introduce a dear friend of mine. Anyone familiar with the work of Dr. Michael Porter knows that there is no way to do an adequate introduction of Professor Porter and his work and accomplishments in the time allotted. A handful of things. First of all, Michael Porter is a university professor at Harvard Business School. And if you know how Harvard Business School works, the title university professor is the highest honor awarded to a faculty member. Michael Porter wrote his first book, Competitive Strategy, in 1980. But it was his 1998 work on competition that firmly established him as the world's leading authority on the competitiveness of companies, regions, and countries. After some additional 17 books, another one, by the way, is in the works, and countless articles, 6 of them being awarded the McKinsey Award for the best article of the year in the Harvard Business Review, Michael Porter remains his status as the most sought-after thought leader on competitiveness and companies looking to improve their strategy and their competitive position. He's a fixture at the World Economic Forum as he chairs the Global Competitiveness Report, the annual ranking of the competitiveness and growth prospects of the 120 largest nations. Earlier this year, he rocked the House at the National Governors Association, think about that for a second, with his analysis of the competitive standing of all 50 states. And today, you're going to see part of what he presented specifically to the state of Michigan. He helped establish the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City, one of the leading nonprofit organizations dedicated to improving the economic prospects of urban areas. And the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City is working with Mayor Bing and his Detroit Works project as we speak. Back in the 1980s, he served on President Reagan's Commission on Industrial Competitiveness, and then he became a founding member of the Council on Competitiveness, an organization that I've had the privilege of being associated with in many roles over many years. He co-founded one of the most prestigious international consulting firms, the Monitor Group. And while I could enumerate the number of awards he's been awarded, I'm just going to hit on 2. First is the Lifetime Achievement Award in Economic Development that was presented to Dr. Porter in 2008 by the US Department of Commerce. I mentioned this one in particular because it was my great honor, along with another Michigan alum, Carlos Gutierrez, then the Secretary of Commerce, to award Dr. Porter with this very rare and very prestigious award. Second, Dr. Porter has been awarded so many times, it is now telling that awards are now being named after him. In Japan, the highest honor a company can receive for being competitive, for having leading strategy, is called, guess the name, the Porter Award. While he's accomplished in several athletic fields, his love of the Boston Red Sox has allowed him to combine his personal passion for athletics with his passion for competitiveness, as he is the strategic advisor to his beloved Boston Red Sox. That's what I call marrying work and play at the same time. And finally, let me just note that I have had the great honor and privilege to know Dr. Porter, to work with Dr. Porter for many years now. And the friendship that was established during my days in government has only grown over time. So it is my great pleasure, my personal honor, to welcome to the stage my friend, one of the world's leading experts on competitiveness and strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Michael Porter.
Oh, Sandy, you've got me in big trouble now. I have to live up to part of that anyway. It's been a privilege to know Sandy and work with him and try to innovate with him in how we think about economic development at the federal level. And it's a particular pleasure for me to have a chance to engage with him here in the state of Michigan. Many of you would have no way of knowing this, but I actually was born in the state of Michigan. I was born in Ann Arbor. My father was at the University of Michigan. He was leading the ROTC detachment in those days. He was a career Army officer. And I didn't spend my whole childhood here. I was only here for a few years, but I've always had this incredible connection to the state. And I'm thrilled with this opportunity to actually be here at what I think is really a fundamental moment for the state. And in fact, I'm going to go even further. I think I'm here because this is the right moment to be here. You've been through a lot. You're all depressed. You're on the bottom of the rankings. Everybody says, "Oh my God, what a disaster." You've had massive political fights about almost everything. Now it's time. Now it's time for Michigan actually to start to move very rapidly in the right direction. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be here. I'm not an expert on the state, but I've done enough work and I have enough data and enough experience that I'm very confident about that. And the question now is, how do we rally around a clear consensus about what needs to be done next in the state? And then how do we actually get it done, given the various institutions that are going to have to participate, businesses, universities, NGOs, government, and so forth? How do we actually collaborate to get things done in a way that kind of breaks the pattern that the state has fallen into over the last some years? What I will tell you now is I'm going to tell you a lot of hard things. The first thing I'm going to tell you is competitiveness is not a partisan issue. It's just the facts. There's a reality about competitiveness that is not subject to debate. We know what it takes to be competitive. We know that if you're not competitive, you will never succeed. You will never be prosperous. You'll never create jobs. We know these things. This is not a partisan issue, but it's an issue where there's a lot of confusion and where people get confused and they think different things that are necessary. For example, some people think that the agenda for the state is creating jobs. That's not the agenda. You can't create jobs. You've got to build competitiveness. Then jobs get created. It's that kind of confusion that I would like to make a small dent this afternoon in trying to clear up. Because I think ultimately we all should and can agree on competitiveness. We should all be able to agree on what are the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 critical things that need to get done in the state. And we should all be able to collaborate because it's in the collective interest of every part of society for this to work. And I'd like to take the next few minutes to try to talk about competitiveness, to give you some of the benefit of what we've learned, both in the study of competitiveness, but also in the practice of competitiveness. I had the opportunity to work all over the world. I work with many other states, not just in the US, but also states in other parts of the world. We've learned a lot now. I'd like to share with you some of what we've learned. But most of all, the reason I'm here is because I think this is the moment to start moving forward, to start dealing with this issue in a very, very different way than we have in the past. And I think you have the assets and the strengths to do it. This state is not a hopeless case. This state has precious assets and precious strengths to build upon. The question is whether we can get things done, whether we can solve some of the problems that all of you will agree are the problems. That's the question. This is a very achievable opportunity to be part of a transformation, not just moving from number 44 to 43 or 43 to 42 or 42 to 41, but to leap ahead in the state. So let's talk about how to do that. Now, as most states are facing the same thing that Michigan has been facing perhaps more acutely, and that's these dual challenges in the year 2011. The very pressing challenge has been to achieve fiscal stability, to kind of get the budget and the financial house in order in government. And you should be congratulated here in Michigan for having made substantial progress, more progress than in many states. This is significant. This is critical. This is fundamental. This had to happen. Without this happening, and it's ugly and it's complicated and it's controversial, without this happening, the state couldn't have moved forward on almost anything else. You've made a lot of progress. But as I think you all know, this was just the start. Fiscal stability doesn't create economic success. Fiscal stability doesn't create economic growth. Fiscal stability doesn't create jobs. The only way to achieve those other objectives is actually to enhance the competitiveness of the state, to make the state a fundamentally competitive place to do business. Because that's the only way to ultimately achieve those long-term and more important objectives that we all share. So the question is, what do we mean by competitiveness? What do we mean by that word? And then, what do we have to do to move the needle? And how do we create the organizational and intellectual framework in order to do that? Let's touch on those basic issues. Now, the question of competitiveness is one that has bedeviled many people over the years. But we now know that the way to think about competitiveness is to understand that competitiveness is the productivity with which you do business and use the resources of the state to create value. If you're productive, if a day of work can produce a lot of value, you can have a high wage. If you're not productive, then you're going to have to squeak by with a low wage. If you're productive, companies will want to grow and hire more people. If you're not a productive location, companies will go somewhere else. If you're productive, you can support a high and rising standard of living. If you're growing your productivity, you can support a high and rising wage. If you're not a productive place to do business, if it's inefficient or costly or complicated or contentious, or you lack critical assets in order to be productive, you simply cannot succeed. That's what competitiveness is all about. It's that simple. Productivity is the iron law of the global economy. When we had a closed economy, you could get by without being productive. Now we have an open global economy, productivity rules. Productivity rules. Every single decision that the state makes must be applied against the test of productivity. Is this making us more productive as a business location? If it is, it's probably a good idea. If it's not, it's a sideshow, it's an old debate, we got to give it up. Productivity must be critical to the agenda of every single entity in the state, every government, every union, every university, every NGO. It's all about productivity. It's all about making business in Michigan productive, so that you can produce a lot of value for every day of work, for every dollar of capital invested that we can marshal in the state. That's what competitiveness is all about. We've all got to get on the same page here. This state has been spending much too much energy focusing on dividing the pie. Who should get what? Eastern, Western, labor, management. That's not going to get us anywhere. We've got to create a productive environment for doing business in this state because that's the only way to keep the pie, even as big as it is, much less expanded. And then, of course, we can hopefully have interesting discussions over time about making sure the division of the pie is fair. But ultimately, the first order question today, now in Michigan, is how do we build much higher productivity in the state? How do we sweep away all the obstacles, the inefficiencies, the delays? How do we deal with the weaknesses that are holding us back from becoming a highly productive state? We've got a ways to go. These are a bunch of metrics that bear on the prosperity and productivity of the location. And these are some of the data that come from our data sets on Michigan. You're probably tired of seeing stuff like this. But I think we got to look at it one more time. We got to realize that even 10 years ago, Michigan was actually not, it was kind of in the middle of the pack on many of the key metrics that we worry about: productivity, job creation. Labor mobilization is what proportion of your citizens are actually in the workforce, new business formation, and so forth. What happened was during the disastrous decade, you can see the state was near the bottom in terms of its rate of progress. It was going backwards, which means that on a lot of these metrics, as of today, you are now down into the 40s. Although, even looking at this chart, there's some interesting things that we need to notice that are very, very, very important. And that is that there are still, even today, despite the erosion of the economy of the state, there's some really interesting and important assets. Look at innovation. Michigan is still a state that ranks very high in terms of innovation. And there's lots of measures of this. The one that's represented here is just patenting, but there are many other measures. Michigan still, despite the problems, ranks very highly on this. And on the bottom, I'll talk a lot more about clusters. Clusters are where you have real critical mass in different fields of the economy. And despite the challenges that the state has had, it has a very strong base, still intact, that can be built on. In terms of innovation, you're probably not used to seeing a chart in which Michigan is actually looks pretty good. This is patenting. And Michigan isn't, up in the Massachusetts and California league at this point, but it's been remarkably innovative. There's lots of innovative activity happening here. So let's just file this away as we think about building a strategy for the state and how to think about what that strategy needs to be. We have some strengths. We have some strengths in innovation. We have some strengths in universities. We have some strengths in skilled workforces. We have some strengths in natural endowment. We have a location through which a vast amount of international trade passes. Very strategic location in the world, in the United States. We've got some assets. We shouldn't see ourselves as in some kind of hopeless situation. Quite the contrary. The question is how to get the ball moving in the right direction, how to start tackling those fundamental drivers of productivity that are going to unlock these assets, that are going to allow them to bear the fruit that we all want them to bear, which is going to be good not only for those of us today, but also for our children and future citizens of the state. Now, what fundamentally drives productivity and competitiveness? Well, I like to try to divide it into three fundamental drivers. Number one has to do with the overall business environment. You've got to have an overall business environment that allows companies to be productive. They've got to have access to the inputs they need efficiently. They've got to have access to the right rules of the game, the right incentives, in order to allow them to be productive. A company can be world-class, but it can be thwarted if its location is not competitive. We've got a lot of Michigan companies that are highly competitive companies, but Michigan hasn't been competitive. So a lot of our highly competitive Michigan companies have done a lot of stuff outside of Michigan. See, that's the difference. The competitiveness of a company is not tied to a particular location. They can kind of move stuff and do stuff in multiple locations. The competitiveness of location has to do with what is done here. And we've got to create the right business environment in Michigan in order to allow companies to thrive here, to be productive being here. And by the way, if they're productive here, the wages go up. It always happens. So what do we need to do there? Number two, we've got to build clusters. Clusters are critical mass. What we find is a single isolated company can never be world-class. That company needs to draw on other companies in the same field. It happens, it's just part of the modern economic geography of the world economy. Think of Hollywood, think of Wall Street. We have to build critical mass of expertise, of companies, of suppliers in the same location. That creates not only productivity, but also creates innovation. What we know about clusters, we'll talk a little bit more later, is clusters are the incubators for new businesses. That's how rapid new growth businesses actually form. They form out of these clusters. So we have to build and strengthen our clusters in the state. Luckily, we have some. Luckily, we have a lot of them. Luckily, they're still intact. Luckily, we have a great base. The question is, do we have the right policies, the right mindsets, the right attitudes to actually take advantage of that? Because those are the flywheel that are going to start spitting out jobs and spitting out companies and spitting out investments if we can create the right environment. And then finally, we've got to get our act together, coordinating across geography. As we'll see, competitiveness is not just affected by state policies, it's affected locally, it's affected in regions of the state, it's affected by our relationships with our neighbors, the state next door, the relationship we have with Canada. All those things have a fundamental impact on the attractiveness of Michigan as a business location. And we've kind of been fighting among ourselves, rather than figuring out how we can collaborate across the various levels of government and geographic levels in order to make this a very efficient, very productive place to do business. One of the things you learn about competitiveness is you want your neighbors to do well. If your neighbors do well, you do well. If Canada does well, Michigan should do well. If one region of Michigan does well, other regions that are nearby will do well. And we haven't approached the problem that way. Because we haven't been thinking about productivity. We've been thinking about dividing the pie. Who should get more state money, rather than how can we collaborate to get it right. Let's talk a little bit about each of these areas, and then we can talk a little bit about how you pull this together in terms of a kind of overall strategy. Now, in terms of the business environment, there are really 4 fundamental aspects of the business environment. One has to do with the inputs, the skills, the infrastructure, the technological base. Another part has to do with the rules of the game, the incentives, like taxation, kind of the rules of the game in terms of investment, protection of intellectual property, and so forth. Some of those rules are set nationally. Many of them are set here in the state. There's the nature of the local needs. One of the things we learn is that countries and states succeed where they have demanding local needs. And so one of our great ways of influencing competitiveness is actually to create demanding local standards and high levels of expectation in terms of efficiencies. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, there's the ability of the location to provide the supporting industries that business needs. These jointly constitute the business environment. And the basic message here is that we've got to improve the business environment to allow higher productivity. If you want to be more productive, you have to have higher skill. If you want to be more productive, you have to have more efficient infrastructure. If you want to be more productive, you have to have access to the right suppliers. If you want to be more productive, you have to have rules that encourage you and support your investment and you're moving to more advanced ways of doing things. The question then is, do we have the right business environment in Michigan? And I think the answer is clearly not today. But the question is, where do we go and where are our priorities and kind of how do we move that business environment ahead? These are 7 areas that I would say most states need to be focusing on right now. And I think these areas apply, all of them, to Michigan. I'm not an expert on the state. I haven't done a study. However, I would suggest that somewhere in these 7 areas are probably your most important priorities right now in the business environment area. Number 1, simplify and streamline regulation and permitting. This is really a pure win-win. We don't want to reduce our regulatory standards. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about simplifying and speeding things up. Surely we can agree on that. There's no reason, if we're going to regulate, to just make it complicated. Let's make it easy. Let's make it simple. Let's give fast decisions. Let's have a very transparent process by which we do all the regulating we need to do, like permits for buildings and environmental permits and so forth. Let's just get that sorted out. Because if businesses have to take extra time and spend extra money to do this, you know who suffers? It's the paycheck. If productivity is driven down by this kind of silly stuff, then actually it means that the workers get paid less because the whole organization isn't as productive. Reduce unnecessary costs of doing business. Unnecessary costs of doing business are costs that are not delivering value. And many states today have higher costs than they need to have because they haven't cleaned up and streamlined a lot of the things that generate business costs. The cost of energy, the cost of taxation. Taxation isn't the driver of competitiveness, but having a kind of efficient and fair tax system really does enhance competitiveness. We all know the data shows that in Michigan you are a higher than average cost state. And the question is, how can you bring those costs down? Not by sacrificing, quality, but just by improving the efficiency with which things get done here. This is a state that's not perceived as friendly to business. Why wouldn't we want to be perceived as friendly to business? The reason we're not perceived that way is things are too complicated, things are too bureaucratic, things are too contentious, there's unnecessary cost, we are duplicating, we have too many entities doing too many duplicative things, we're not being efficient, we're making things complicated. We've got to sort those things out. These things on the top take no money. Doesn't require a big budget allocation. It actually saves money. These are no-brainers. Are we ready in Michigan to start tackling some of these no-brainers? Rather than just be stuck in the old discussion, oh my God, we can't change this, it's too complicated. Number 3, establish training programs that are actually aligned with the needs of the state businesses. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. There's a lot of the jobs in the modern economy that don't require a college degree. Welding, fixing engines of trucks, well-paying jobs, great long-term opportunity to build a good living and raise a family. But right now we have a mismatch between our training system and our needs in our economy. So how do we create a match? How do we create a labor market so that the training is provided for things that companies actually need and will need in the future? We got to fix that in the state. You can fix it in the state. We just have to get on with it. Focus infrastructure investments on the most leveraged areas for productivity. What we find is lots of states spend a lot of money on infrastructure. But what they spend it on is kind of this strange process. Rather than a process that thinks about, okay, where if we made infrastructure investments, will we get the most spillover effects, the most bang for our buck? Let me give you an example. This is a state that is in a very strategic location. Massive amounts of trade are passing in and out of the state, given our location. We need good infrastructure to flow that stuff in and out of Michigan. In fact, if we had really great infrastructure, we'd be an amazing logistical hub for America. So there's an area where we ought to put some infrastructure money. Now, whether we need yet another road in a suburban community that already has a bunch of roads, probably not right now. But we've got to start being smart about where we're putting our limited resources in terms of physical infrastructure. And many states have just not been smart about that. It's been political. It's been the old style, you know, my community gets this, my community gets this, every community wants to get this and this and this and this, rather than what really would allow the state to move ahead and to expand the pie, and then we'll have more resources in the future that we can spread around, you know, more evenly. We need to design everything we do to support emerging growth companies. You know, emerging growth companies create most of the jobs. Not little companies. Little companies don't create most of the jobs. And big companies lately, because of the restructuring of how big companies operate, the outsourcing, the globalizing, big companies haven't created that many jobs. It's those companies in the middle, those companies that go from being 5 employees to 50, from 10 to 100, from 20 to 200. Those are the companies that are in the sweet spot of job creation. They are the sort of the glue that kind of holds together the modern economy. And we've got to make sure that we have policies that make it easy for them to grow, to get the permits, to find financing, to not have unnecessary obstacles. They don't have the big departments that do the regulatory stuff. You know, they're little companies. We need to make things easy for them. There's been some really good work done in the state on emerging growth companies. The SPARK program in Ann Arbor is particularly notable and well regarded around the country. We can do this, but we have to make sure that we make it really easy for companies like this to be in Michigan. We need to protect some of our critical assets. One of the most critical assets this state has is the universities and institutions for higher learning. You've all heard of Research Triangle? Big success. Guess what? We have that in Michigan. We could have a Research Triangle here too. We just haven't thought of it. Just haven't looked at the opportunity that way. We've got to protect those assets. So as we get capital to invest in the state, and as companies think about how to support the various institutions that they draw on in the state, we've got to make sure that we protect these institutions for higher education and research. This is our future success. It's our current success as well as our future success. And finally, public education is just one of those things, and unless we get it right in the long run, nothing's going to go well. And clearly not just the best schools, but having good education for all. This is something that all states now, thankfully, are working on. Hopefully, Michigan is taking the lead. Hopefully, you're pushing the envelope. I've heard good things, but this is an area that has to be done. So I guess the question is, what's the scorecard? You're citizens. You're here. How are we doing? Are we tackling these issues yet? Have we got real clarity and focus? Do we all understand why all of these things are in everybody's interest? How we can get on with these things? That would be the kind of questions that I would be asking myself as I would be thinking about the future competitiveness of the state. Let's talk a little bit about clusters. A cluster is a geographic concentration of companies in a particular field. This is a picture of a cluster in Massachusetts, my state, in life sciences. Massachusetts is fortunate enough to be the single leading center for life sciences, you know, on the face of the earth. We're very lucky because that is an engine of innovation and growth and jobs and new companies that is just paying dividend after dividend after dividend for our state. Thank goodness we have it. A cluster is companies. First and foremost, a cluster is about companies because, of course, companies are the only place where you can really create wealth in society. You've got to have for-profit companies out there making money and competing, you know, in their business. But there's also, in clusters, there's also various kinds of institutions. So you see here the universities are part of this cluster. They're integral to the cluster. They're deeply connected to the cluster. We see all kinds of services that are part of the cluster. So, you know, the business services, venture capital firms, service providers are part of the cluster. And we also see in the cluster some institutions that organize and bring together the various actors in the cluster to kind of facilitate collaboration, to deal with common problems. And the depth of this cluster in Massachusetts is so strong that it's just been, again, it's just spinning out opportunity. It's spinning out opportunity. That's what a cluster is. Here's another cluster, very different. Oil and gas in Houston. Now you might say, and you'd be right, that Houston doesn't produce much oil and gas anymore. Most of it's gone in that particular region. It's been depleted. But what's been created in Houston is not a place that sells oil and gas. What's been created in Houston is a massive global center for technology and knowledge in this field. So you see the oil and gas companies are still there, they're still headquartered there, but there's also the suppliers, the technology providers, the subcontractors, the business services, the specialized institutions, the great university programs. That's what a cluster is all about. It's when you get this critical mass. It's not just companies, it's also institutions. It's also an organizational glue that holds things together. That's when you start to see true competitiveness. Now, clusters have a fundamental impact on economic success. Now, we now finally, after decades of work, have the data to be able to prove this. They affect job growth, they affect wages, they affect patenting, they affect new business formation, they affect how much new businesses grow. All these things are benefited by the presence of a cluster. If a company is part of a cluster, it's able to be more productive, it's able to be more innovative. That's what the data is now showing us with great clarity that we've never been able to see before. Now, as we think about how economies develop, economies are combinations of clusters. And this is a sort of a schematic diagram. I hope you can read the lettering in these bubbles. But think of this as an economy. But the way this picture is drawn is very interesting, because what it shows is that there's overlaps across clusters. So look down in the lower right. See that automotive thing in the lower right? It's actually in purple. Well, you see that automotive overlaps with production technology. And what that says is there's a lot of synergies between those particular clusters. There's a lot of overlapping skill and technology and even suppliers that really supply both. And you can see that automotive overlaps with mining and metal manufacturing as a cluster. There's a lot of overlap. And you can see that in other parts of the economy there are other overlaps. You know, some clusters like textiles kind of stand out there on their own. They're kind of disconnected from everything else in the economy. But other clusters are sort of caught up in these overlaps. And what we've learned is that these overlaps are profoundly important for how an economy actually grows and develops and diversifies over time. And hold this thought for just a moment, and we'll talk about Michigan. As we see how economies develop, they don't develop randomly. One cluster grows out of another cluster. And then that gives rise to another cluster. And then that gives rise to another cluster. And then clusters grow together. And the intersection becomes the benefit of, starts the seed of another new field for that location. That's the way economies grow. That's the way economies develop. San Diego is just a wonderful example of that, where I've happened to have worked. Now, here's the cluster portfolio of Michigan. And the red bubbles are the clusters that are losing jobs, and this is over the last 10-year period from 1998 to 2008. 2008 data is simply being used because the government hasn't yet spit out the 2009 data. So we're a little bit behind. But these relationships tend to change relatively slowly. So you can see automotive has taken a tremendous hit. We still here in Michigan are the #1 automotive cluster in America by a meaningful margin, but you've been losing share. Losing significant share of national employment in automotive. Other regions have been gaining that share. You see metal manufacturing and production technology and plastics are all very substantial clusters with a very substantial share of US employment in their fields. It's not an accident that all those clusters are here. Automotive has given rise to production technology and to metal manufacturing and to plastics. Those are all connected. Don't think of automotive as separate. There are tentacles and connections between automotive and all these other fields in the economy. And that's one of the reasons why the state was so wealthy and so strong for so many years, because that positive flywheel was turning. And these connections were spinning out new businesses. Now what's happened is, of course, that flywheel has turned in the opposite direction. But I think now we have the moment, again, to reverse the flow. And this picture, although there's a lot of red on it right now, is a picture that's actually a very, very strong picture for a state. There's tremendous opportunity here. There's tremendous foundation on which to build. There's some emerging areas like motor-driven products, aerospace engines, and biopharmaceuticals where you've actually gained jobs in the last decade, and other areas where you're holding your own. This is just the gray part of the earlier chart. Again, these slides will be posted and made available to any of you. I want you to get a picture of a very robust economy with a lot of critical mass already present. It's not like South Carolina. It's not like Mississippi. It's not like that at all. There's a lot of strength here. The question is, can we get out of our own way in terms of the business environment? And then can we create a process to really build on these strengths and drive these clusters forward? We've been doing that in Massachusetts. Other states have been doing it. You know, can Michigan do it as well? If we take that earlier schematic and look at Michigan, here's the picture. These are the clusters that are shaded here in which Michigan has a meaningful position in the United States. They're not random. They're interconnected. And we can look at this chart and see more opportunities to kind of continue to build out this economy and harness some of these strengths going forward. If we can get the right set of policies, if we can get the right strategy, if we can get the right consensus about what we need to do going forward. What are some of the key action items here? What we know about economies is you can't create clusters from scratch. You can't create clusters from scratch. You can't hope and dream. You have to build on your existing and emerging strength. It's the only way. The best way to create a new cluster is to strengthen your established clusters. That's the way new things get spinned out. I've heard a lot about ideas in the state for creating new economies and diversifying the economy, and some of them are great, but many of them are just never going to happen because they're sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. We've got to build on our existing and emerging strength. We've got to find stuff that's working, and then we've got to make it work better, rather than try to hope and pray that we can create something out of nothing. Never happens in economic development. We need to pursue economic diversification within clusters and across related clusters. This gives us kind of a roadmap of how to think about where to go. Let's help our existing areas of existing and emerging strength, let's help them grow. We need to create a process where the private sector can work with government to help itself, to upgrade itself, to improve the institutions, to improve the training programs. We don't need government to create training programs. We need government to help the private sector create the training programs that it needs in order to fill the skill gaps that it is experiencing. So there's a whole new way of thinking about economic development that's very different than the kind of top-down model of the past where government's trying to decide what to do. It's really the private sector organizing itself to upgrade, and in the process engaging government who becomes a good listener and who delivers on the stuff that government needs to do. The private sector helps them understand. And there's a lot of other economic policies in the state. We've got to start aligning them with clusters. You know, states do export promotion, they do investment attraction, they do all kinds of things, but they're doing them without effectiveness unless they're kind of lining those other policies up around the various clusters that the state has existing or emerging positions in. And this chart just gives you some of the examples. Again, if you want to do good workforce development, connect it to clusters. Get your production technology folks together, talk about the kind of workforce skills that they're looking for, collaborate with them in developing programs in community colleges and universities. That's the way to do workforce development. Don't just create a workforce development system that sits out by itself, trying to invent the jobs of the future. Let the private sector invent the jobs that they need, because they know what they need. And then you have some place for people that graduate to actually go and get a job. Third area that is driving competitiveness is this whole issue of collaborating across levels. And this is a problem in many states, but it's a particular problem in this state. Partly because of your size, your complexity, partly because of the history of the state, the history of the discussion in the state among the various interests. I mean, of course, Michigan is a critical unit of analysis. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done at the level of Michigan. But a lot of what drives competitiveness is really done in the metropolitan areas, the regions within Michigan. That's where the people are, that's where the universities are, that's where the companies are. They're not in Michigan. They're in a part of Michigan. They're in a region of Michigan. We can't just think about Michigan strategy, we've got to think about regional strategy. What we find is that regions, even within one state, have very different economies. They have different clusters. They have different strengths. They have different opportunities. They have different neighbors. And they need a plan that reflects their circumstances, not a one-size-all-fits plan from the state. So we've got to have a state strategy, but we've also got to have strategies at the regional level. And we've got to learn how to connect better with our neighbors. We've got to make it really easy to do business and to connect across borders. Not only the Canadian border, which is a fundamental asset we have, is this close proximity to the most prosperous part of Canada. We've got to leverage that, but we've also got to leverage the relationships with our other states. We've got a bunch of different economic areas in the state. These are very different economic regions with very different problems. We've got to find a way to move forward to address each of them, not try to mask the very great differences that we see here. This is just some data on how the various parts of the state are doing, and we see tremendous differences. And each of those bubbles on that chart, which is a metropolitan area in the state, has a different competitiveness problem. And we've got to create a structure that allows those problems to be tackled in a tailored way within the umbrella of an overall state strategy. Let me just conclude by saying that in order to get all this done, what we found is that we need actually to have a strategy. And that strategy has to start with a sense of what could this state achieve. What could our unique position be? What are those unique assets that we have to build upon? What we've learned from thinking about competition in any sphere is you can't be successful just minimizing your weaknesses. The only way to truly be successful is to understand and conceive of what your strengths are and could be, and then invest behind that vision of the future of the state and the future of the regions within the state. I think the next challenge is not just to list all the areas we have to work on, and there's a lot of them. Our next challenge is to put that job, that agenda, within a strategic framework that we can start to get consensus on among the various interests in the state. People need to have a sense for where they could get, not just a sense for where they've been and how to get a little better. And I think this becomes really a threshold issue facing the state. And again, given the time, let me just conclude by saying that if we're going to succeed at competitiveness, we're also going to have to embrace a new process model. Gone are the days when economic development is the job of government. Yes, it's the job of government, but it's also the job of every institution in a society. The most successful states and the most successful countries are the ones that actually can achieve collaboration, that can get business and government and universities and state government and regional governments all working collaboratively on the common agenda of productivity, the common agenda of making things more effective for doing business, the common agenda that ultimately we must address if we're going to be successful as a state. So, can you do it? Is this state actually ready to start moving this direction? My bet, and it's a little bit of a sentimental bet because I was born here, my bet is yes. My bet is we're tired of what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years. My bet is we've had a lot of the old discussions about the non-issues. My bet is that there's an opportunity now as things are starting to get a little bit better. There's an opportunity to kind of change the direction. You've taken the critical steps on fiscal stability. You've taken some critical steps in terms of a few aspects of the business environment. The question is now, can there be a process to kind of build this strategic vision for where the state needs to go, and then start really collaborating to get things done? I'm willing to make the bet that you're ready, and hopefully over the coming years that'll be proved to be right, and I'll be just proud and pleased to be part of it as we go through this hopefully very interesting ride of turning Michigan into a vibrant economy once again. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome WDIV anchorman Devin Scillian.
Your remarks inspired all kinds of thoughts and questions in me. I want to start, though, with the follow-up, talking a little bit about innovation, which has become an almost pervasive thought in my mind as far as helping Michigan move into the future. I'm driving a Chevy Volt right now. I've had it for 2 months, and on my 2-month anniversary, I checked, and I'm getting 207 miles to the gallon. I couldn't remember where the gas cap was when I did have to stop. I've only filled it up with gas twice in my 2 months. But so innovation is, to me, clearly, it's a miracle that I'm driving around right now. But I wonder all the time when we get into creating and talking about innovation and creating the culture of innovation, when we start chasing the math scores, for example, of India and China and Finland and Korea, do we start to degrade whatever it is in the American culture that creates innovators? We're still the country where 2 guys go into a garage and come out with an iPod. Mm-hmm. What do we do to keep that in our system?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand that innovation and improving educational attainment are not mutually exclusive, and they're not conflicting with each other. We need to do them both. We need to improve the quality of our education system in the United States. Particularly, we have a very good higher education system, performs very well. We track the best students in the world. We need to maybe allow some of them to stay, or a few more of them to stay that want to. That would be a smart, pragmatic thing to do. If we really cared about our competitiveness. We need, however, the really crisis in America is the educational opportunities for the students really that are more from disadvantaged backgrounds, that have never had a parent go to college before. That is the pressing challenge, and that is going to be critical to allowing all Americans to benefit from this wonderful economic opportunity that I think we can create again in this country over the next 10 or 20 years. But in innovation, America does still have the best overall environment for innovation. Yeah. All the data shows that. Yeah. There's a cultural dimension to it. In America, it's actually honorable to fail. That's almost unique in the world, that it's actually honorable to fail. If you tried and failed,
we could do with a little less honor, frankly.
Yeah, but yeah, that's how the success happens. That's how those innovators. But also, let's not forget that we actually have done a lot of innovation in Michigan, and a lot of it's going on today. I mean, I'm on the board of a company called Parametric Technology, which is the world leader in a product category called product data management, which is the way to design and manage products over their entire life cycle, from creation to the support and renewal over time. And that product was invented in Ann Arbor. Yeah. And that is now the basis of a world-class company. So there's a lot of innovation going on here. There's a good technological foundation. There's very strong universities that are highly competitive in getting research funding. They're spitting out a lot of patents. Michigan has a good environment for innovation, but we've got to pull some of this other stuff, these other distractions, these other costs, these other obstacles off of the table. Yeah. I think the innovation here can flourish, but it's the simple stuff, frankly, that is pulling us down.
Yeah. One of your action items kind of feeds into that a little bit. You said that design all policies to support emerging growth companies. We've had an interesting debate in this state over policy directed at particular industries. Mm-hmm. Yep. Alternative energy, the film industry, and we have a governor who's decided we can't pick winners and losers. We need a blanket policy that works for every company, mm-hmm. but are we missing targeting some of these?
Well, you know, when I talk about clusters, I want to be very clear. The cluster doesn't mean targeting. All clusters are good. Wherever you can start to build a critical mass of expertise, that's good. There's not some clusters that are better than others. And so what we need to do as a state is we need to create an enabling set of policies that allow all clusters, any cluster, to upgrade itself, to improve the skill levels, to improve the infrastructure, to to raise its level of technological capability, to improve environmental performance, whatever it is. In a sense, when you talk about a cluster-based policy, that doesn't mean picking one cluster over another. That means organizing government to actually support clusters who come forward and say, look, you know, we're the production technology cluster, we're collaborating, here are some of the critical things we need you as government to do to make us more effective, mm-hmm. Will you work with us? And we need a government that says, yeah, you know, that's what my job is. My job is to help you be more productive. But tourism, as it is in production technology, as it is in IT or biopharmaceuticals, they're all good. And one of the things that Michigan has that very few other states have is the richness of clusters. Mm-hmm. And now we have to reorganize the way we provide government services and government programs in order to meet the needs of those clusters, rather than sort of have government entities trying to do more sort of cookie-cutter policies. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I'd like your thoughts on globalization and how in fact, we in Michigan seem to have a little bit of trouble with provincialism on this idea. You want to start a really good rugby scrum in here, just ask people to define what exactly an American car is right mm-hmm. now.
Yeah.
We have, for instance, Chrysler. Beautiful to see it, very profitable and doing so well, but it's also now an Italian company. Mm-hmm. How do we sort of navigate our way through this idea of what's truly American, what's good for America? Is that necessarily good for Michigan? Is it? We struggle with that all the time here.
Yeah, well, it's good. It's a good issue, and it's an issue that everybody struggles with, frankly. You know, what we should care about fundamentally is not actually who owns the shares. What we should really care about is what that company does here. Okay? And, you know, Massachusetts, I showed you that life sciences cluster. Well, you know who's in that life sciences cluster? Novartis, you know, Bayer. Every major pharmaceutical company in the world has a major presence in the Boston life sciences cluster, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of employees. Because, and what they're doing in Boston is they're doing very sophisticated, advanced knowledge work, and they're getting paid very, very high wages. And the fact that they're actually owned by Swiss shareholders versus a company that's owned by American shareholders actually is very secondary to what actually they're doing in Massachusetts. Now, what determines what they're doing in Massachusetts is the nature of that environment that we're providing. And because we have a lot of skilled people, and because we have a pretty efficient regulatory structure, and because we have a cluster, those companies gladly feel that they should be doing those complicated and advanced things in Massachusetts. So I think we shouldn't get hung up on actually who owns the stock as much as putting ourselves in the best position to get Chrysler to be doing design engineering here, advanced work here. We want Chrysler to view this as a critical platform for their global business. But in a global economy, we can't be trying to get our companies to not be smart and do things where they need to do them to build their international competitive position. So I think if we just focus on making ourselves a productive location, making ourselves a very attractive place to do highly productive work, then we're going to be just fine. And the blurring of who owns what is gotten so complicated that I think that's a secondary issue in the equation.
Last thing I wanted you to talk about a little bit. You are the father of an idea called shared value. The idea that for companies to truly survive and thrive in the future, they can't really be about their own business. They've also got to fit into society in a proper way. The government has to do the same thing. I think it's particularly keen the way that an automobile fits into people's lives. That's a great issue for us. But can you spend, I know it's impossible for you to just sort of encapsulate this. But if
for those of you who haven't read it, there was an article I wrote called Creating Shared Value in the Harvard Business Review in the January-February issue of the HBR this year. And I have been very concerned that we have a very dangerous situation going on where I think the public has really lost faith in business. I think there's too many people in America that believe that businesses are succeeding at the expense of their workers and the communities in which those companies are operating. And the legitimacy of business has been falling. And I've been thinking a lot about why is that, and what can we do about it? And what I've come to believe is that we are in a time when the greatest economic and profit opportunities actually come from businesses recognizing these fundamental challenges that involve the environment, utilization of resources, water, poverty, disadvantaged citizens. And shared value is the idea that you can create economic value by also creating social value. So if you're a food company, don't think of yourself as selling food. Think of yourself as selling. That creates shared value. Just out of curiosity, what does a tobacco company tell itself? Tobacco company is going to have a hard time telling itself anything good. That's a difficult question that we won't resolve today. That said, every company here in this room can create shared value, either through the way your product influences a very important societal problem. Again, nutrition, the environment, health, safety, whatever it is, or the way you conduct your business. We are learning that the resource-intensive, logistical-intensive supply chains that we've all built aren't efficient, and we're going to have to dismember them, and we're going to have to rethink how we use resources, how we use packaging, how we use water, how we use energy. And I think actually there's an opportunity now, given this new insight and new understanding of some of these shared value ideas, that we're going to see stuff coming back to America that left. I think there's a real opportunity for Detroit. I think I think companies are now understanding that they are dependent not just on themselves, they're dependent on their suppliers. And that if their suppliers aren't healthy, they can't be healthy. So I think there's an opportunity to kind of redefine the way we think about capitalism and about what making a profit is all about. And I also think our young people are hungry for that. I mean, the students that we're graduating from the Harvard Business School, they don't want their purpose in life to be creating shareholder value. That's not what life is all about. They want to create shareholder value while creating societal value. And it's figuring out how to put those ideas together that I think is going to generate some of the most innovation in business and management over the coming 10 or 20 years. It's not so much meeting the conventional needs of the conventional customers with the conventional products that is going to energize our companies. It's meeting a whole broader set of very deep societal needs with a very different conception of products that I think is the innovation engine. And again, the automobile is a perfect example, and the Volt is just a metaphor for what I'm talking about. Yeah. You know, here's a product that creates shared value. It's tackling some of the most fundamental issues that we're struggling with as a society through the capitalist system. And we've got to harness more and more and more of that going forward. I think we can.
Let's give our thanks to Dr. Michael Porter.
That's great.